Welcome to the last big session of our conference, and which is a terrible time of the day, just after lunch, but we try to make it very live, I hope. And this is a kind of a special session, which comes out from a request by the Assembly of last year in Turin, when people realized that the EMI people were something different from a normal academic conference. EMI conferences are very much concerned about history, the past, and the research, but also they are very active in working on migration and how to convey the result of the research to the public in various ways, through centers, to museums, as we heard this morning. So that last year, the crisis on the refugee crisis just became worse and worse, and people asked to have, during the EMI meetings, to have a moment of reflection on what's going on in the European migratory field, or even in the global world concerning migration. So we decided to introduce a section on to reflect on what has been happening the last 12 months since the last meeting of the EMI, and we asked our participants to reflect on this. In order to ease their task at the Alta Italia Center, we decide, can you put the video? Yes. We decide, what happened? Oh, okay. We prepare this, let's call it video, which is not a video, but it's the list of the major events that occurred related to migrations during the year. Some are not directly related to migration, but they are in a looser sense. So as you may read by looking at the video. And that's just a reminder. Many of these issues will be talked about by our panelists and by more people who will be on the here later in the next part of our session. Also, I would like to say that this session is open to the public, and we really encourage you to speak, even if your name is not on the list or not on the program. For instance, Sarah Clement will introduce us to a short video on the Calais events of last spring. Now, I'm going to leave the floor to our real speaker, the first speaker, and which are going to address some of these points, some of the crises which occurred in Europe the last 12 months. It will start Tina Magazzini of the University of Deusto in Spain, talking about the Roma integration and the Roma problems. Paul Bosbeck, the North Frick Institute, which will host next year conference, is going to have a reflection on what happened last year, this year, and what we'll be doing next year at this at his place when the conference will occur, always in the optic of analyzing the emergencies which are coming out from in the migration field. The last speaker of this first part of the session is Jean-Barthélemy Debost from the Musée National de l'Histoire de l'Immigration in Paris, which will take us, maybe it's a bridge to the discussion we had this morning And he will show us how museums are asked to intervene when migration crisis came up. And so this is for the first part. I will speak a little bit later on the second part. So now, Tina Magazzini, you're welcome to present your paper. Yes, we interrupt this.
We can resume it.
Okay.
At any point later. So let's see. It was here. No. Sorry. Era abrir. No. Con... Ah, ya está. Perfecto. Okay. Genial. Okay. Gracias. Okay, so does this work? Yes, great. So many thanks to Amy, Maddalena for introducing and for having me at this panel. What I will be talking about, as Maddalena was saying, I think from my point of view has everything to do with migration, but is not explicitly on migration, because what I work on is integration policies for Roma communities, which has become an increasingly relevant topic in European debates and national debates over the past decade, more or less. So maybe I'll just take 1 minute to explain how I got to this topic and where this project comes from. In 2012, I was working at the European Commission when the European Commission asked national governments to come up with some national strategies for their own Roma populations. And this greatly stemmed from a migration issue, or a migration worry, let's say, of Western Europe towards the idea that by opening the borders and a now wider Europe would mean that particularly deprived and marginalized population of Central and Eastern Europe, of which Roma are overrepresented, would eventually migrate towards Western Europe. So this draws heavily on what right now is the final stage of my PhD thesis. And I will kind of go through the introduction, contextualizing a little bit why I think this topic is so relevant and has much to do with European crisis today. And as this morning somebody said, it's much more of a institutional and structural crisis than a specific crisis tied to migration. How I went about methodological data collection issues, and basically draw what are my conclusions so far. So I should begin by explaining that this research project is a comparative study of integration policies, mainly focused in Italy and Spain. And I'm happy to give the details of why I selected these two case studies. But basically, it's also a way to make a more general contribution to the understanding of how stereotypes affect policymaking. And by this, I mean not only stereotypes about the Roma, but also and mostly the stereotypes that we hold about mainstream society. Because when we build integration policies, we're obviously integrating something into something else. And that kind of broader society that we're integrating the minority into, I think, is what is very problematic and what comes out. So the questions that I addressed were basically how this whole issue came about. Roma in Europe did not appear in the 2000s. They have been here for about 5 centuries. So what is the problem represented to be with regard to Roma integration? What assumption underlie this representation of the problem? How and where this representation of the problem came about? Who produces and reproduces it? And what is left unproblematized? And ultimately, what effects are produced by these representations of the problem? So I'm going to trace a little bit, just in recent history, kind of how this has become a big political issue and the different ways that countries have had of addressing it. And the main point that I would like for you to keep in mind is basically who belongs to the target group of integration policies, because we're talking here about an ethnic group, basically. And at least in most of Western Europe, we cannot collect data based on ethnicity. So basically, what governments were asked to produce was policies integrating a community that cannot be really targeted because we don't know how many people, where, who exactly we're talking about. And also what exactly is meant by the term integration, because this was left up to each country to decide. And this also triggered a number of controversies and polemics and crises between countries on what we should mean by integration. And this obviously has very practical and serious repercussions on the policies that are produced. So to contextualize a bit, my starting point is that within the debate over the meaning of social justice and this cultural identity and integration debates, not so much attention has been paid so far to the role that the state plays in shaping structures of both recognition and redistribution. And here I'm thinking of Nancy Fraser and her basically statement that you have different kinds of inequalities. You can have inequality of redistribution in the sense of socioeconomic injustices, but also you can have inequalities of recognition in the sense of status and acknowledging another group as equal. And particularly in time of economic crisis, the intersection between these two levels, the economic inequality and the cultural one, I think has become more consequential. And so I was interested in looking at the intersection and how they overlap and how they reinforce one another. And in this regard, basically the whole European interest around the Roma has started in the 90s, and I think terminology is also very important. And in the 90s, at the end of the 90s, is when actually the European Commission and the Council of Europe stopped talking about gypsies and start talking about Roma, more or less, in which more attention is paid in also conceptualizing and thinking about minorities and recognition as well. And particularly about complying with the Copenhagen criteria in 1997, the conclusion of the European Commission was that the integration of minorities was generally satisfactory, except for the situation of the Roma minority in a number of applicant countries, which gives cause for concern. So this is when more Western European governments starts to realize that this is not only a Central and European issue, but it has serious repercussions also on minority law in general. I mean, in the 95, 97 is when we started having the first treaties about the National Convention for the Framework Protection for Minorities, linguistic minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities. And within the wider EU efforts to develop multicultural diversity management programs to deal with migration and with integration, the EU heads of state in April 2011 asked for endorse a youth framework for national Roma integration strategies, which basically links the Europe 2020 strategy to the integration of Roma communities. And the way that this is presented as a directive is that basically there's a gap between Roma and non-Roma in the access to, it was 4 main core issues of education, employment, healthcare, and housing. So the interesting thing here is that there is absolutely no reference to migration or to a difference in cultural identity or to recognition. It's basically just framed as sort of a disadvantaged population that needs to be brought up to level with the rest of the non-Roma population. And the issue of who belongs to the target group is not irrelevant, because this, I don't know if it's, maybe it's too small to see, but basically the green line is the maximum estimate of the Council of Europe about the amount of Roma in each country. And so on the bottom line, there's like the first ones are Romania, Hungary, Spain, Bulgaria, Slovak Republic, France, and Greece. Then the red line is the minimum estimate of the Council of Europe, and the blue line is the official data. So if you take, for example, Spain, which is the third, you see that the official data is 0. The minimum estimate is about 500,000, and the maximum estimate is 1 million. And so this, for a policy officer, it becomes very difficult to build policies for a population that is officially 0 and somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million. And so there have been some efforts to define this group in terms of who are we catering to and who needs to be integrated. And the term Roma, as it is used by most of the documents of the European Commission and the Council of Europe, refers to this group as an umbrella, which includes groups of people who have more or less similar cultural characteristics, such as Sinti, travelers, collège, and voyage, etc., whether they're sedentary or not. Then there was a EU platform for Roma inclusion, which also includes the Shkali, adding the history of persistent marginalization as one of the functional attributes. And also it makes explicit that the term Roma is used in the context of a policy document dealing with issues of social exclusion and discrimination. and not with specific issues of cultural identity. So basically, long story short, I think Martin Kovacs, which was the advisor at the time of the Commissioner for Inclusion, Economic Inclusion at the Commission, summed it up pretty well, saying that Roma is in the eye of the beholder. So it can be used in different ways by different people, depending on what the policy goal is. And the way that it has come to the newspapers basically is in very extreme and very racist ways. So if you give me let me know how much.
Yes.
Okay. So these are some of the statements from some of our policymakers in Europe over the last few years. And one would think that some things would only come from the far right, but actually it's not the case. So this has become a very mainstream sort of discourse. François Hollande in 2012 stated that the origin of the problem, that is to say, the movement of a population that is nowhere accepted and lives in abject conditions, is that we did not establish a European regulation to keep that population where it ought to live, in Romania. And Roma immigrants are inherently different and cannot be integrated. This was the Interior Minister Valls, who is now Prime Minister in France. So basically, this boils down to the fact that there is some kind of social policy being constructed for a population that is defined both in ethnical terms and also as a poor and excluded minority. So the issue is that once poverty exclusion becomes or is turned into your identity marker, the policy also becomes that of erasing your identity to some degree. I'm pushing this a little bit. But so basically what I did was I took a policy frame analysis, so the study of how public policies rest on frames that supply them with underlying structure of belief perception and appreciation. And this is not really a study on Roma identity, but rather of how policymakers who build these policies think about what they should fix, what the problem is. And so what they tell us really is not so much about the target group, about the Roma, but about how the majorities think about minorities and how we address them really. And so the way that I did it, I'm gonna accelerate here a little bit. But basically, I did a policy process analysis, so a selection of policy documents at the national, regional, and state level. And I did semi-structured in-depth interviews with the main policymakers responsible in Spain, in Italy, and at the EU level for these policies. And where I was coming from, my assumption was kind of in Italy, the whole policy framework for the Roma has been built on an emergency crisis cultural perspective, with the idea that because they are inherently culturally different, we need to build camps where they can preserve their nomadism, which has created some sort of oxymoron, such as sanctuary nomads, because they actually don't move. Whereas in Spain, the policy has been quite on the opposite, that of providing a very efficient, it's usually shown as a success case of socioeconomic integration in the sense of social housing provided in the 80s, etc., but which in turn has totally overlooked any kind of cultural difference or identity that there might be. I'm obviously kind of summarizing very quickly, but the kind of big issues that came out from these analyses of interviews were mainly that you had these three big strands of issues. One were the cultural ones, the other were the economic ones that intertwined, and one that was actually quite often left out, but that plays, I claim, a very important role, is the issue of representation, of the kind of voice in terms of lobbies, policy, being able to vote, etc. So the deductive coding started out from the categories of redistribution recognition, but also other categories emerged, such as migration, housing and spatial dimensions, secularization, and containment and control, which has a lot to do with lack of representation as well. And the concept of integration is really explicitly defined in the policy documents and strategies, but what emerged was basically that in Italy, it is meant to be primarily a route to becoming part of the Italian society, while in Spain, it's usually used to refer to a socioeconomic condition. And okay, this also, my fieldwork went for over 2 years, and it had to do with some projects by the Council of Europe. And in the meanwhile, there were some unexpected developments, such as the Mafia Capitale trials in Italy. I don't know if anybody is familiar with that, but basically it just uncovered a huge business that was going on an institutional level of taking advantage of corruption over camps for Roma and for migrants. So many of the interviews that I did with policymakers are also people who are now standing trial for corruption in this case. And in Spain, recently, the IRIS, which is the Institute for Housing, for Rehousing for poor people, has been dismantled. And I looked at the different regions that have specific policies for Roma, and La Rioja just created one, so I might have to add this case. And at the EU level, one very recent creation is called ERIAC, which is the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture. So it made me think it was very interesting to hear this morning about the issues of museums tied to migration awareness and participation, because this has been a very, very controversial measure, not so much because it's just a museum created about the Roma, but because it's the first museum that is backed and funded by the Council of Europe, so basically by European taxpayers' money. And this has created a whole controversy on whether it has the right to do so, on who it is really representing, which Roma, etc. And also in the data interpretation, yes, there's a gypsy, a Roma saying that there are such things as false truths and honest lies. So in terms of just jumping to the conclusions, as expected in Spain, privilege measures based on economic focus, while Italy favored justifications through the cultural integration paradigm, even though it really turned out to be more of a whole corruption scheme, most of it. But so the reality is that the Roma targeted measures in both countries are really not a case of special or exceptional policies, but rather reflect and exemplify quite accurately the general political approaches of the two states towards minorities in general. So in the case of Spain, reticence to engage with the cultural claims, but the will to push towards eradication of the chabolismo, tied to the low-level employment and social dumping. Whereas in Italy, the Roma minority is small enough and fragmented enough that it can easily be used as an object of policies, as well as for political campaigning as a scapegoat. So I would say that the bottom line is to sort of try and look at, whenever we're dealing with migration policies or integration policies, who belongs to the body politics. So what I saw in terms of the Roma community, and I'm sorry this was very squeezed, was that at a certain level, they occupy the same kind of socioeconomic space than migrants do. So doing the jobs that normal middle class is not willing to do. On the other hand, there's Ferraioli speaks about the border of humanity. Humanity has been expanding. So at one point, we accepted women to be part of humanity, or Black people to be part of humanity. Now there's a debate on which Roma can belong to humanity. And it can seem like a joke, but it's really a matter of what kind of marginalized societies are useful in terms of economic social dumping, and there's other parts that are not even useful for that. So they become completely politically invisible and are just used for political campaigning. And the link is just to the Global Diaspora Day, which was an exercise put together by different NGOs on combating xenophobia in other means. And so I made a small video that if anybody wants to check out their different videos here. In one, I took this description of Italian immigrants in New York in 1912, in which they're described as dirty and lazy and not wanting to integrate, etc. And I had different person repeat it and kind of wonder about who we're talking about, because it really resonates with the discourse that we're hearing these days in Western Europe about the Roma. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. I have many questions, but I will wait. Now is Paul Postbeck.
Is it on? Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, friends from and of Amy, once again I'm very happy enjoying together with you one more great and also intensive meeting. My hearty thanks to the team in charge, especially to our Emilia, for giving me the opportunity here to stake out my claim for 2017. I like to sketch my main points with the following 4 questions. First, how do we see the phenomenon migration generally? In Turin, we heard that we, the researchers, need to provide a new narrative for migration movements away from the mainly negative image. You see, she ended in New York, I'll begin with New York. Away from the mainly negative image. But what happened after Turin until spring this year, in Greece, along the so-called Balkan route, in Germany, as far as north as Scandinavia, was extraordinary. It was a burden. It was the absence, maybe the breakdown of order. And it was in times irritating as well as frightening. And maybe the consequences, which are mostly not willingly caused by the refugees and the migrants, are still potentially dangerous. Now, a year later, we can say that the pedagogical approach described in Torino is dishonest, is even more on the retreat, as it has become very clear that that migration contains both positive and negative aspects, as everything in real life does, depending on the people involved. Only in ideology or wishful thinking it is otherwise. But there is still too much thinking of just that kind going on. But there is hope. Yesterday, we learned, for example, from our colleague, José Manuel Sá, I think was his name, from Coruña, that a new approach, more pluralistic and cosmopolitan in thought, is on its way, starting with a correct definition of keywords. Second question, accepting that migration is the rule and not the exemption, and knowing that there will be still more people on the move in the future, the core question is and will be, how do we deal with foreign influences? What do we do if these influences are not only adverse to our way of living, but openly hostile? Even if this always goes to only for a minority, we have to ask, and to ask us at first, what can be integrated and what ideas and people have to stay outside? We saw the colorful plurality of the migrant tour onto the fish markets and other places in Porto Palazzo in Torino. You find that at many other places in Europe now. Like Little Germany or Little Italy in New York, townships like these, for many migrants, are the first step to earn a living, and by doing so adjust to their new surroundings. But when does this transitory thing end? And when does a static, monotonic, parallel society begin? A society that perpetuates intentionally everything different. Geographically, we have them on the same spot. Niall Ferguson, maybe you know him, a well-known and influential Harvard and now Stanford historian, in an interview to the German newspaper Die Welt, compares Europe with the United States. Migration from the South will make the US a more Latin American and more Catholic land, he said. Migration from the Islamic countries will make Europe more like the Near East, he continues. So, the problems Europe had to solve in the future will in this respect be more like the ones of the United States. And I would add, especially like the United States of the past. Ever since 1886, Lady Liberty greets newcomers to New York Harbor with these words of Emma Lazarus. But at the end of the century, they are the words, but at the end of the century, when a seemingly ever-increasing number of very foreign-looking immigrants came through the gates of Ellis Island, these self-conscious, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, to more and more, people seem to be leading the wrong way. So by and by, this multicultural, tolerant, immigrant society came into a crisis, gets increasingly nationalistic and racist, and with the beginning of World War I doesn't tolerate nearly any deviation from the Anglo-American standard. Dealing with this hotspot of immigration, the first main topic of the 2017 conference will be New York, melting pot and battlefield. We know if it's a melting pot or a salad bowl, a battlefield it was no question. New York is and was the very place where all our migrants met. There we can see all the different ethnic and native groups interact, segregate, as well as integrate. We will surely hear about Ludwig Nissen. Did everybody say inevitably? No, not even else. We'll surely hear about Ludwig Nissen, the immigrant from Husum in North Frisia. His life story, leading from rags to riches as a successful businessman, is the example of a perfectly integrated immigrant. That as a German-American member of the Anglo-American elite, he had to fight hard to make his way during his time of the German bashing in World War I. This makes his biography even more interesting. And hopefully we will hear about some of your migrants too, for they all come to this birthplace of our modern world, to New York, this hotspot not only of immigration, but also of integration. Let me again cite Niall Ferguson saying, "Let us be happy that the people coming to the US are from Mexico and not from Morocco. This means not as foreign and difficult to integrate as immigrants from an Islamic country." Although an historian, Ferguson did not refer to the time when the US lived through an intense, if not to say brutal, clash of cultures with indeed the bigots of its ethnic minorities. For an independent, self-conscious German or German-American diaspora who want to live as Americans of a German kind, as Dietmar puts it yesterday, as a German kind and as a recognizable, as a visible German kind, and as such being respected as emancipated and as equal with the Anglo-American mainstream. And that would have been the crucial and the fatal point in the end. To this, for them, hyphenated German-American, predominant as they thought they were. For them, the declaration of war with Germany on April the 6th, 1917 was like the doomsday. It sure was payback time. Since decades before this, the relationship between the Anglo and the Americans, the Anglo and the German Americans had turned constantly to the worse. And this is a warning example of what can happen when any constructive communication between a minority and the mainstream became impossible. Here we have the link back from the past to the present, but hopefully not into the future, for there seem to exist strong parallels between these ostentative, proud German Americans before World War I and the Islamic community, and especially the people with Turkish background in Germany today. Both are big groups, so their ethnic quarters naturally can survive for generations. So to the native people, they easily seem to be clannish, arrogant, and bound to segregate. They speak a foreign language and possess an old inherited culture they cling to. They do so stubbornly and against all good reason, as many annoyed natives stated to boast. They are a very heterogeneous group from the inside, but from the outside look like a monolithic and at least potential dangerous bloc. The Germans, the Teutons, and later the Huns, as well as the Turks, the Muslims, the Islamists. And additionally, it seems as if Sultan Erdogan is on his way assuming in the German press the role so-called warlord Kaiser Wilhelm has in the US newspapers, who, as you can read, in the 1919 had without any doubt since decades been laboring hard with the active help of the German-American National Alliance to undermine the free American society. And on the other hand, you read about integrated German-American politicians with Turkish root who defend the proud Turkish people and its famous president. Reading in the sources Ludwig Nissen and others defending their Kaiser and the fatherland against Anglo-American attacks give you more than one déjà vu effect, only that this is not an illusion. Hopefully we will dwell on this during our conference when we are passing over to our second main part on the second day, and this will be Europe and immigration, danger and enrichment. Let me continue with my questions. Two left, third. Why do we have not only a heavy migration, but additionally a migration crisis? And fourth, why is this European crisis tried to be solved on the national, even nationalistic level? What makes us first of all a crisis of the EU, the European nation, European Union? All of this is not the fault neither of the refugee nor the migrant. He behaved like all human beings would do, trying to save his life and or to improve his living conditions. But coming in great numbers, he makes manifest our shortcomings without our communities. Let us switch back again to Torino, 2015, and Ferruccio Pastore, remember him, who in a very impressive paper showed us how inside Europe new borders sprang up all along the route of the migrant. No one liked to become, as he said, the dumping ground for this people nobody wanted, and showing that Dublin treaties additionally caused severe conflicts between the protected core of Europe and the border states. But in the following 6 months, the Dublin system broke down, and it was just this center of Europe that became the dead end of the Balkan route. All the more, after the Scandinavian countries shut down the borders, it was Germany that became the destination and the hope of more than 1.5 million migrants and refugees. And Germany in those days became in more than one sense the heart of Europe. But Europe is not uniform. And I say, thank God it is not. We all see developments out of our national, historically founded views. Help people in danger is a general human motive. But one cannot understand what is called in Germany the culture of welcome in the fall of 2015 without looking at our heritage from World War II. This time we wanted to be the good ones. Come what will. We are strong, we are rich, wir schaffen das. We can make it. And it was a too good opportunity to show to the world that we have changed and get rid of some of the old bad stereotypes. On the other hand, to see the deep distrust of Chancellor Merkel regarding heavy protective borders, you have to know that exactly such kind of a border separated her from the free Western world all the time of her youth. Additionally, in the so-called culture of welcome, you can find a streak of the left wing and negative Ausländereien and Deutschland verrecke, what means that the more foreigners will come, the more and the sooner the originally bad German character vanishes. So what happened derived from the mixture of motives. And we went a long way from the emphatic, we can make it, in September 2015, to a sturdy culture of welcome in the end of 2016, hearing Chancellor Merkel say to Syrian refugees, we expect from you that you will return home in the end. So, what we did, and even more the lines along which we discussed, have been and are typically German. And how could it be otherwise? It is the same in all states of Europe, but it's necessary that these prerequisites, mostly based on national history or prejudice, become outspoken and conscious. If not, they result in irrational and dangerous behavior, not at least at the ballots. Brexit, I say. I hope we will learn more about this next year. It doesn't matter if we start from different directions, as long as the final destination is the same. A united Europe compiled by national states and of course by regions. In Torino, I remember, we heard that the national state is dead, at least doomed. We learned yesterday from Professor Devoto, I think he's there, in his opening lecture that there is a decisive difference between the crisis of national narratives and the still vital national state. But the nationalistic state stays better be dead, because in it the region cannot survive. And without any doubt, when it comes to integration, the region is of decisive importance. Here, abstract statistics, and we have a lot of them during this conference, these abstract statistics materialize to men, women, and families. Only the region is the place where people are at home. Here is the very place of integration. Or let's put it in the words of Ludwig Nissen, the US-American self-made man from New York. He says, "I am a Brooklynite, first, last, and always." The integration will be the task for more than one generation. Remember the Burqa discussion, and you know how difficult it will be. We heard about this. Today it was to diminish the distance between East and West, and are coming away from mostly negative stereotypes about Muslim women and families. This will be work. But if we give way to the so-called easy solutions, we will copy what happened to the German Americans just 100 years ago. That the views of our people are deeply divided doesn't make it any better. It is easy to demand integration from an immigrant, but it is not enough. You have to tell them how to do it and how it will definitely not work. But we cannot accomplish this without knowing first who we are and what we want. Confronted with a foreigner, and among them some outspoken enemies of our way of living, we are compelled to define what is ours, what is the common cultural, social, and historical sphere we want to share, but to preserve also. This process will start and get the strongest impulses out of the regions too. It is a kind of plurality of identities, what we heard about, starting in the region, building up to a European identity that has as a result that, for example, France, Spain, people from Yugoslavia and from the EU are not seen as strangers anymore. So it comes out of the region. Friesque Futur, meaning North Frisia in the future, or the future of North Frisia, is called the new addition to the main building of the Nordfriesque Institute, housing our exhibition showing what we think is the essence or is essential of our region. We will visit it next year and hear more about this topic. What counts in the end is the day-by-day life struggle of the average people. They had to find a way of living together, but we scientists can help, offering orientation, analyzing, showing examples, telling stories about what happened to people in other times and other places. We help politicians to create needed majorities, backing solutions that are democratic, pluralistic, liberal, and European in thought. This is an important task because there are, meanwhile, not only immigrants of various generations to integrate, but also a growing number of the native population is showing clear signs of alienation and disintegration. So we will do 2017 what the EMI motto says, creating public awareness and understanding of Europe's migration history and heritage, to understand what is going on and to be ready for the things to come, or even shorter, looking back into the future. These are the main lines along which I will formulate the call of papers and discuss it with you, and invite politicians and publicists to maybe join us. The preliminary date will be the preliminary title of the 27th conference of the Association of European Migration Institutions, together with the Northern Museum Ludwig Nissen House in Husum and the Nordfriesque Institute in Braested is at home. Here we have Paddy's question about where is home, but where is Paddy? at home or uprooted and alienated, migrants and natives, between integration and parallel society, between culture of welcome and xenophobia. We will likely meet from Thursday the 5th to Saturday the 7th October 2017 in the towns of Husum, Bredstedt, and some other places in the region of North Frisia. Thank you for listening, and see you next year in North Frisia. Thank you.
There was a lot of propaganda in your speech, I must say.
But only under the
very, very soft. Okay, let's go to Bartholomew Bust.
Yes. Hello, I'm very pleased to be here with you on that last afternoon of our meeting. So I'm representing the National Museum of History of Immigration from Paris. And I think it's maybe the first or the second time that the museum is represented at the AMI reunion. I've got something to... Santiago PPT. That's it. Thank you. And reading the first paper I received about this meeting, I thought that yes, the museum could take a part of the discussion about how our institutions have reacted in front of the European crisis and not the migration crisis, thanks to our friend crises, who explained us that it was a European crisis. So I will try my best to explain how the museum answered to this crisis. First of all, I will put the landscape of 2015. In France, 2015 was, of course, the loud music of the loud sounds of this crisis. But at the same time, we had to live with several attacks, terrorist attacks, that took place in January and November 2015 at Paris and in Saint-Denis. If these two events, the European crisis and the terrorist attacks, has no connection, and I will explain how there is a confusion in the heads of a lot of people in France, they largely participate to the life of the museum. If we have just a small backwards sight, in June 2011, so that's 5 years ago, more than 200 of migrants, Eritreans, Sudanese people, Libyans, Syrians, was held in the Italo-French border at Vintimille, and they spent several weeks near the sea, not knowing what was going on. And it was a big fuss in the newspapers, especially in the southern French newspaper. A few months after, led by the Sophia Antipolis University, took place a meeting on territories and people from the borders, the example of the migration on the border space of Thousand Alps, 19th century, 20th century. So problems with migrants on the border, a meeting about this question with a historical background, that gave us the idea in 2011 to think about an exhibition about borders. And that exhibition could take place, let's say, in 2015. In January 2015, just after the attack against Charlie Hebdo and the kosher supermarket, the museum has been solicited by many associations and local authorities, conferences, meetings, visits, all this to try to answer or try to think together to these huge questions. How can we reinforce the transmission of the values of the Republic? Fraternité, égalité, liberté. Other question, should the concept of secularism, laïcité in French, defined at the end of the 19th century and engraved in France by the law 1905, should that concept be redefined because of what was going on? So huge questions were asked to the museum. And the museum is still asked such themes until now, especially coming from structures working on the front line, on the front social line in the suburban areas. September the 2nd, 2015, you remember the photo of Elan, this little boy found dead on a Turkish beach, goes through the world. 10 days after, but that was prepared just after January, just after the attacks of January. The museum, answering to a request of the Ministry of Culture, houses roundtables, street artists demonstrations, movie festival, humanitarian organization on a special theme, 12 hours to change our perception on migration. On that special Saturday, 3,000 people, visitors, came to the museum to try with us to change their perception on migration. That was in September. In November the 10th, the museum opened its new temporary exhibition, Borders, an exhibition that was thought in 2011. 3 days after, the 13th of November, the attacks in Saint-Denis and Paris against the Bataclan and the bars around took place, and 130 people were shot dead. So you see that in this, when I talk about this landscape, how the chronology is really articulated between what was going on outside and what was going on inside the museum. So what was this exhibition, Frontières? It was thought in 2011, but its development, the work going on that exhibition, crossed two things. First, that European crisis, and also the fact that a new president was coming into our museum. That was Benjamin Stora, who is an historian, who is a famous historian about Algerian war between France and Algeria, excuse me. And he joined the museum in August 2014. So he wanted to see what was going on that border exhibition. On that time, it was quite finalized, and he gave ideas that modify quite a lot the exhibition. Before him, the exhibition was in three parts. The first part was on the borders in the world, focused on hotspots like Mexico versus US, North Korea and South Korea, or of course Israel and Palestine. Second part of the same size, what's going on at the level of Europe, and especially around the Mediterranean Sea. Third part, what is the history of borders in France, from le précaré, invented by Louis XIV with Vauban, constructing all the big castles around the borders. This first scheme of exhibition, of course, changed. Even if the hotspots of hot points of borders, the chapter about the hot points of borders was still there, even if the chapter about the history of French borders was still there, of course, the middle chapter about Europe took a much bigger place. It began to be the center of the exhibition, and the global atmosphere of the exhibition was concentrated on what was happening in the Mediterranean Sea. You can see on the poster of this exhibition that it focused dramatically on what was going on those little ships traveling through the Mediterranean Sea. An exhibition about limits and about their limits. Entering the exhibition, the new exhibition, the one who take place in September, who began in November, excuse me. Entering the exhibition, you were confronted by two art pieces of Bruno Bugelal, who is a French artist. The one in front of you was 9 videos taken by Haragaz, the one who burned borders traveling through Mediterranean Sea. It was videos taken by mobile phones on the ships. And this artist took 9 of them, and by a special, the first one coming in, then fading away, the second one coming in, then fading away, you are directly confronted what was going on the sea. And on your left, the same artist was presenting a second piece of art. It was a few photographs of southern side of the Mediterranean Sea landscapes, but because of an accident with his camera, all these photos were overexposed, so nearly white, and the visitors could hardly see fading landscapes, disappearing landscape, as if he was on a boat crossing the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, during the exhibition, walking through the exhibition, the system of control of the streams of migrants, the images of journeys and human disasters, the rules of Frontex, huge maps showing how many deaths you can find on every Mediterranean and European borders could be seen. For the first time in that exhibition, a contemporary press review was presented. It was hanged with magnet, as if we could change it every week. Well, we didn't change it, it was there for once. But it was the idea that this exhibition is in our nowadays life. We can change it as soon as the events are coming in. In the introduction of the exhibition catalogue, Benjamin Stora, our new president, writes, "The events of the recent months confirmed that the stream of migrants will not stop easily." So the exhibition is talking about something, and this thing is going to continue beside the exhibition. Our executive director writes that the borders have been put under the spotlights by the last events. So Frontières is really au cœur de l'actualité, in the heart of what's going on. She also adds that this contemporary point of view is enlightened by the long term given by history. And the exhibition opened 3 days after, as I told you, the terrorist attacks, in the Vigipirate ambiance, atmosphere. Vigipirate, vigilance, pirate. That means policemen everywhere, security guards, and so on. And also the museum was tickled by demonstrators of the extreme right-wing, very little party, l'Action Française, putting stickers on the lamppost around the museum, saying that I'm not Charlie, I'm Charles Martel. Charles Martel, who for the one who don't know who Charles Martel is, he was the grandfather of Charlemagne, and in 732 he won against the Muslims in the Bataille de Poitiers. Let's close the thing. These same demonstrators were shouting "On ferme," closing day, because there are too much migrants in France. So that was what happening with the exhibition that opened in the same, in that atmosphere. But as I told you, we were asked by many associations and by many local authorities to try to think about with them about what was going on. Soon after the attacks against Charlie Hebdo and the kosher supermarket and the Bataclan and the bars, it was known that the terrorists were not migrants. They were born or raised in France, they were French, they were Belgian. And so very soon, some people thought it has nothing to do with this European crisis. It has to do with something else. These events witnessed of many years of abandonment of what was going on in the suburban areas. Nothing has been learned on 1983 March for Equality. Nothing has been heard about what was going in 2005 when all these northern suburbs were taken by huge riots against racist crimes that took place in 2005. In January the 20th of 2015, our Prime Minister was describing the suburban territories and population, mainly issued of immigrants' family, as they were enduring a social, ethnic, and territorial apartheid. On that social front, social workers, teachers, sociologists could say that the values of the Republic were there very weak, that there was some racism between them and the persons they were in charge, and also racism amongst them, amongst the teams. And for a lot of these people, the situation was very confusing, themselves being quite frequently militants of real social and civic rights for all. So they were militants, and what was their Bible, if I can say so, was falling apart. In that atmosphere, strange or not, the museum was seen as a landmark, as I describe it in my introduction. Yet, our museum is not a museum of the history of secularism or of the history of diversity. It is the museum of the history of immigration. It's interesting how we appeared as a landmark, because it shows that there is a need of state institution that could deliver reflections about how being a citizen in the country, as simple as that. Where can I have information on how to be a citizen in my country? And the museum was in their radar screen. In March 2016, the museum hosted the Week of Education and Action Against Racism and Anti-Semitism. And we are asked these last weeks to bring some traveling exhibition into prisons to support the de-radicalization policy in prison. Why should we, museum, think of what the why should we, museum, think of what the European crisis of migration make us do? For me, the real question is not about the European crisis. We have done the job. Frontières, beside or because of all this, was a difficult subject. But in 5 months of life, it received more than 70,000 visitors. So it really fulfilled his purpose. How can historians, sociologists, geographers, demographers, politicians, but also artists and witnesses could give to the visitor what he was coming for, key facts for better understanding? The real question, I think, is, are we, memorialist institution, as Fernando Devoto called us Wednesday in his opening lecture, are we memorialist institution? Are we going to lose our soul by stepping into the present? And this question is often discussed inside the museum between the people working in the museum. Let's this time take a larger backward sight. What's in the mirror? An image of an institution that has always been in tension with what was going on around it. And listening to you, it seemed that we are always in our jobs, in our researches. We are not free of what's going on around us, and we are not free of asks put by politicians, asks put by citizens. The decision of the creation of the museum, I will be quick. The decision of the creation of the museum was taken in 2003. That's 1 year after 2002, a presidential election in France, where Jean-Marie Le Pen, National Front, was second at the second tour. So Jacques Chirac, who was elected, decided to take time to think of what policy of integration could emerge in France after this political disaster. And in his policy, he thought that, helped by association, helped by researchers, he thought that the creation of an institution where we could learn about the history of immigration was a good idea. So our institution respond, of course, at scientific questions. History of immigration is a black hole in our national history, national narrative, but also, and the decree signed by the President of the Republic says so. Of course, we have to create a collection, preserve it as it has to be preserved, and to show it to a lot of visitors. But second mission, this is to change the representation of the French society upon the immigration history. And in May, so we opened in May, so this is a political mission. In May 2007, a large number of the members of the Scientific Council of the future museum resigned because of the creation of a Ministry of National Identity and Immigration, putting together these two notions, national identity and immigration. This was put in the first Nicolas Sarkozy government, was not acceptable by these members of the council of the Scientific Council. It was not their resign was not against the museum, but against the Minister of Immigration and National Identity. The museum finally, at the end, opened its doors in October 2007, Nicolas Sarkozy being president. The museum is inaugurated in December 2014, François Hollande being president of the Republic. So it took 7 years to be inaugurated. From October 2010, all these examples of how we are not sealed in our ivory tower, but we are crossed by what's going on in the society. From October 2010 to January 2011, the museum is occupied by nearly 350 undocumented immigrant workers. So somebody in the museum has to think, am I going to open the door or am I going to ask the police? And somebody in the museum say, I'm going to open the door, because this is the place of the history of immigration. And these are part of this history. So I'm going to open the door. And during their stay in the museum, day and night, the museum was open to the public. Some guided tour were made in the museum for them and for the others. So these examples shows that the museum is far away from an institution hermetically sealed. But does this porosity prevent us to build a solid base of knowledge for the visitors of the museum, the visitors of its library, the visitors of its pedagogical team? Yvan Gastaut and Catherine Vitol de Vanden, the curators of Borders, are two very solid academic researchers. Our next exhibition, temporary exhibition, Ciao Italia, will show 1 century of Italian immigration in France. It is co-curated by Stéphane Mourlan, who is a famous historian, French historian, specialist on Italian immigration. We will soon start an academic study on how the immigrants participate to the French mathematics school, which is one of the best in the world. We will construct a series of meetings with Générique and Sarah Clément here about can we speak about constructed heritage buildings of immigration in France, and so on and so on. That means that being open to what's going on in the society, that doesn't, that is not against constructing a really important historical base of information. To conclude, the immigration question is, since many decades in France, not far or in the center of the political debate. It is also the second main subject of anxiety of the people living in France just after unemployment. That's what the poll says. Who could imagine that a national museum on the history of immigration could be strictly away of that debate? Looking to the history of immigration through the eyes of the scientifics, through the eyes of the contemporary artists, through the eyes of immigrants themselves, it questions our society. And the answer that gives the museum is part of the nowadays debates. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we can have 10 minutes question and answer time, and then we proceed with the other part of our section. Is there?
Thank you very much. I just want to add to Jean-Barthélemy Debos, because it's the point of view of association in these projects, that the originality of the museum is also a large part partnership with association, and also the reflection and creation of the museum comes from, as you said, from the political situation in 2002, but also from a lot of associations like Générique and others, of course, working on the history of immigration from 20 years before. So it was a large field, but not like academic, more associative works. After in the 80s, it was university works from Gérard Noiriel, Benjamin Stora. So it was like a background a little bit to give to the politicians to be aware about this subject and make like institutions. So it was just an addition things. Thank you.
Yes.
Just in front in a pink shirt.
First row.
Yeah, I can talk loud. Yeah, I have a question about the facade of the museum. It is a beautiful facade, this Art Deco bas reliefs, right? But it has this obviously blatantly colonial, imperialistic representations of Africans and Asians. And, have you ever thought of doing an encounter about that? The irony or the contradiction of a museum about inclusion and diversity with a facade that is so colonial and right?
Well, I have to say,
it's not your fault.
we try to paint it in black several times, but the paint doesn't stay. No, more seriously, when the question is interesting. Is it the middle? Is it the heart of the subject? I don't know, but I will answer. When the idea of the museum took place at the same time that the creation of the Museum of the Art Premier, Quai Branly, which has put out of the museum all the collection of the Musée des Arts d'Afrique et d'Océanie. So the museum, the palace, was empty, as the Musée de l'Homme was also empty. All the objects were going to the Musée du Quai Branly. So, and the question was, where are we going to put this National Museum of history of immigration. People thought that maybe we could put it in the suburbs because there are plenty of immigration in the suburbs. But the people who were supporting the project said, no, we don't have to, we have to be in Paris, we have to be in a palace, and we have to be a national museum. It's a good idea. It's a bit difficult to assume, especially if that palace is the colonial palace. And for many years, I think that the museum closed his eyes on these bas-reliefs and the painting inside the museum. But since 2015, I'd like to say, so I think it's since 2015, more and more we talk of what we had under the eye, saying that maybe, because it's very pedagogical, it's huge, it's plenty of stereotypes, it's really in its juice, as we say in heritage talking. So why don't we use these pictures, propaganda pictures, to ask ourselves, that was the type of representation people from the 1930s had among, on the people from Africa, Black Africa, North Africa, Asia, and so on. Maybe we could ask these kinds of representation to ask ourselves, what is our nowadays representation about migrants coming from Sri Lanka, coming from Mali, coming from Cambodia, and so on. So more and more, the pedagogical teams are taking this image to describe them, to try to objective them, to context them, and to ask the visitors. Now, let's think of how we look the migrants today. So we use it now. Well, I'd like to swim with some of the fishes. It's no swimming pool. It's I like you to scratch a bit more on our colonial story. So the museum is on the fourth floor, and on the basement there's an aquarium, a fish zoo, created in 1931, and it's still there. There's no fish of that period, and there's no archaeologist of that period, but the fish zoo is still there. I can tell you things about it. It's very interesting, but it's a conservatory of how fish zoo were thought in the 30s. So it's like a Beaux-Arts museum with living paintings. Voilà, it's still there.
Since only sardines migrate, let's talk about. I think that's something that always strikes me as something which doesn't work when we are speaking about such important issues, contemporary issues, and we use the word museum. Because museum, of course, is something which, in a way or another, take you to the past, take you to something which is frozen in a situation, while migration are moving and are moving in space and time all the time. So it's something which strikes me as incongruent, but this takes me to another point I wanted to make, that we should very much give some time to reflect to the words. When we speak about integration, and when we speak about looking at both sides of migration as positive or negative, or well accepted and not accepted, I think that the word integration should be defined in the sense that there are many integration, as there are many identities. Now everybody accepts there is not one identity, but plural identities. Also, we have many different kind of interpretation of the word integration. So if we speak about social integration, economic integration, familiar integration, cultural integration. We are speaking about very, very different things. Which is very, very important to me when we talk about culture, because the positive, for instance, let me make an example with France. Little Italy's have been for almost a century an example of failed integration. They were a ghetto, they were a banlieue, they were something separate from the society, they were defensive and so on. Now they have become the bright side of immigration, because a gift Italians made to the world, because they created nice neighborhoods where you can have good food, theaters, and a lot of cafe and good times. So things changes, and the positive approach to immigration might come out, but that's the opposite of that's the integration which was a failure at the beginning and became positive in the end. So just to say that words are very much changes, and also always talking about integration. Magadini was saying before, Tina was saying before, was speaking before, the unmentable Roma within Italian, Spanish, or French societies, and but once Chinese were the unmeltable ethnic in the United States, Indians were not part of. In a more cultural sense, were Germans, well, Italians too, but they were different. But Chinese and Indians, it was a very racist approach. For Italians and Europeans, was more a cultural approach to exclusion. And I think we have to differentiate, because I think it's very important. So things changes. And they are very much political, as changes the role of museums in making collection. I don't want to take too much time, but I have a question for Tina. Don't you think that Roma, I know very, very little, but don't you think that Roma became migrants and considered more as migrants after the Berlin Wall collapsed, and people from Eastern countries and Rome from Eastern countries started to circulate in Europe?
So very quickly, yes, indeed. And but the thing is, does this, I think in the majoritarian imaginary, this is absolutely the case, and especially in Italy. But we're talking, for instance, in Spain, apart from these figures, like realistically from the Secretariato Gitano or the NGOs that work on these issues, I would say that the figures are closer to the 1 million than to the 500,000. And of these, very, very small percentage come from the Balkans or from Romania and Bulgaria. This is a very recent phenomena in Spain. So in a country of about 40 million people, we're talking about of 2% of its population, which is of a different ethnicity and has conserved a number of features, cultural ones, not the language. Romanes is practically not spoken in Spain. But in Italy, instead, it's fascinating because we're talking about a country that is over 60 million and that has a Roma population that roughly is usually estimated between 150, 180,000 people. So we're talking about 0.2% of the population. And of these, more than 50% are Italian citizens. The thing is, in the 90s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the wars in the Balkans, etc., yes, there was definitely an influx of roughly, the estimates are 40,000 people, of asylum seekers to Italy. The thing is, very often, this has to do with not only the rights that are afforded, but also the rights to have rights. And what kind of category you fall in, not only as a EU citizen or a national citizens or not, but what kind of access to information you have. And so in that sense, what was said about I love the expression of the museum, where can I go and have information on how to be a citizen in my country? Because this is what has happened to a lot of Roma in Italy, not necessarily those who fled the Balkans in the 90s and arrived in Italy, but their sons and daughters who were basically born stateless because they do not have a citizenship of origin, because the country that their parents came from no longer exists. But Italy does not recognize jus solis, which means that basically they have to wait until the 18th year of age in order to apply for citizen. If they know how to do it, they have a window of 1 year. If you miss that window, then it's really, really difficult and complicated. And in that 1 year, you have to prove that you have never left the country in which you were born. So all of this has huge consequences also on the social imaginary of who these people are, because they get treated as non-citizens because de facto they are very often. I mean, Italy is the only country right now in Europe that has a significant problem of statelessness. But yes, it's also true that right now we're at the third generation of people who should be enabled to have Italian citizenship, but who don't. And this also affects access to education, to health, etc., which means also linguistic issues and integration, etc. And if I can take advantage of this, that's super quick. I was just very fascinated by the whole museum experience, and it feels like really this memorialist institution, c'est un déport de combat. It's really like, on the one hand, what I understand is that it was shaped and formed after the 2002 elections, and it's a national institution, so it's state funded. And on the other hand, does this affect in any way the direction? Because it was very nice to have this kind of background of the presidentials, etc., and the fact that right now, I mean, as Prime Minister Manuel Valls, he's the one that I was quoting as having the anti-Roma statement, but he himself is Spanish origins, and so we have this interlace. And of the 70,000 people that pass by, what kind of demographics, what kind of people go there? Is it like preaching to the converted, or is it immigrants themselves? Or are there people that would not normally step into an immigration museum, but who generally go to artistic events, etc.? Thanks.
Okay. So one word about the museum and the National Museum. Again, thinking of that project, what will be the status of that place where we could learn about the history of immigration? And the guy, Jacques Toubon, who is now Défenseur des droits in France, he's doing a wonderful job, especially with the Roms, decided it will be a national museum, because National Museum is the top of heritage in France. So if the idea was to recognize the history of immigration, you couldn't put it in a cultural center or a provincial museum, no offense to the province, but in a national museum. So we are the cousin of Le Louvre, we are the cousin of Orsay, we are the cousin of these 40 national museums in France. So we are 99% financed by the state. That means the Ministry of Culture, Ministry of National Education, the Ministry of Research, and the Ministry of Interior. Because who is in charge of the immigrants? It's the Ministry of Interior. And the Ministry of Interior can have things to say to us. And last thing he said was, why won't you be a museum of migration? Not immigration, but migration. That means also museum of the Auvergnat who comes to Paris, the Alsatian coming to Paris, and we could have folkloric dances. I have nothing to say about folkloric dances, but it's not a problem. The problem is not there. The problem is what's going to happen with the immigrants and how are they, or what's going to happen with the descendants of the immigrants which are living in the suburbs. So that's about museum, and we are a national museum. But because of when he was thought, the thing that explained Sarah, who was around the table when it was thought, associations, searchers, and so on, gives him a special shape. About frequentation. We haven't lose a lot of frequentation these last month because we have no tourists. Louvre has, the frequentation of Louvre has lost 20% because of the Japanese and the Chinese. We have no Japanese, too bad. We have no Chinese, too bad. You don't come to Paris to visit the National Museum of Immigration. So we don't have these kind of visitors. And our visitor, individual visitor, is like the visitor of the other museum. Middle class, 40 years old, well-educated, and so on. This is for the individual visitors. For the group visitors, we are the champion of public, as we say, from the social field. And we have lots of groups coming from around Paris. This is where the public comes. And also we have some partnership with some area around Paris that gives more facilities for people from these suburbs to come to the museum.
Thank you. Fernando, one quick question and a quick answer, I hope.
No, about the French case, you say Charles Martel. There is a key point, because I think that there is a problem with a construction, a memorial construction as the museum, and other more influential memorial constructions in France, like Pierre Norat's Lieu de Mémoire. Then, if there is an old book, the Suzanne Citron, that put clear that if there is not a discussion about how do you think the history of France, there is no place there in the history of France for immigrants and for non-European immigrants, because Charles Martel is the conflict with Islam, no? See, that is the beginning of France in the narrative. In a narrative, there is a problem, a major problem, because memorial operations are very complex. Are not only your museum, but there are others, instruments. No? I think that maybe a more open debate between historians, not only between memorials, about France, la Francité, la République, and so on. If without that, it seems that the memories of migration are marginal. I think, but I'm not French.
I think the debate would be too huge, so we'll pass to the other, but we are invited to intervene later on. Of course. So,
thank you for the invitation to be here today, and especially to talk about a so important issue, the European migration crisis, but as my colleagues say, also the European crisis. I'm a student of European Studies, political science faculty in University of Florence. So my goal today is should be adding some points to the so-called open discussion to have a better comprehension of the current news and maybe some aids to know what could happen tomorrow. So let's start. It was the beginning of July of last summer when János Áder, the president of Hungary, decided that on the October the 2nd there will be a referendum. The electoral meeting here quoted that the Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has been invoking since many months will have as object the European Commission plan for the relocation of the refugees came to Greece and Italy. This plan, approved by the European Council, where heads and governments and states are united, approved by a majority of the states members last September, one year ago, Hungary voted against it. Even if they were minority, because Hungary was not alone in that occasion, the charismatic and discussed Hungarian Prime Minister chose to follow his position. And after some months, today, he has a primary role in Visegrad Group, a group in which there are 4 of the European Union countries: Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. The test of the referendum will be, as you can see, do you want the European Union to be able to mandate the obligatory resettlement of non-Hungarian citizens into Hungary, even without an approval of the National Assembly? A question posed by a provocative tone that, of course, does not read the core of migration issues, but amplifies the rhetoric around it. Rhetoric is the key word to understand the campaign around this referendum. The result will be already enough obvious, that is to say, a victory for Orban that will reject the plan. And again, the plan, the campaign, has seen rising xenophobic and racist tones against refugees that were mainly supported by the government. Think of the brochure that the government itself printed and distributed, bridge in which there are huge queues of migrants at the door of the border. The Hungarian border, the Austrian one, no one knows because it's not possible to recognize the policemen there. The second poster says, "Did you know Brussels plans to settle a whole town's worth of illegal immigrants in Hungary?" Images that we already seen during another referendum campaign, whose results left every one of us shocked. The referendum was set on June 23rd. The result was Brexit, and the images were once published by the Leave side, led by Mr. Farage, the leader of UKIP. Hungarian government, beyond, was worried in drawing a map of European citizens where not to go, the so-called no-go cities. Because it was supported by members of Fidesz, the political party of Orban, those cities are characterized by crimes linked to the presence of migrants. And again, it's not important if in that blacklist there are also some boroughs of London where there were some urban revolts during the summer 2011. So before the beginning of the civil war in Syria and much before the current emergency of refugees. The message sent to the majority of Hungarian citizens is that migrants bring crimes and violence. I can argue that Hungary in recent times had quite economical performances. Its GDP has known a rise, both at national level and per person. But the country itself must also face an even higher and higher demand of workers, caused by a loss of young people, the brain drain, that emigrate to richer European countries. I would ironically say that every country knows a history of migration. But anyway, the relative economic growth can reach within the country borders new workers, as in many European countries. Why? Because Hungary itself is knowing a progressive aging of the population, and the fertility tax in Hungary is lower than the European average, and is lower than the German one. And we know that German adopted the so-called open door policy mainly because it's an elder country. This problem, and I haven't talked about the Italian case where leaders of the xenophobic party Northern League say migrants don't pay taxes, but this fact has never been proved. Instead, we know that foreign people in Italy pay more than 10 billion in contributes that are useful to pay about 620,000 of Italian pensions. Or maybe also I could argue relating to Brexit, that in the UK, the NHS, the National Health Service, is still alive and still there, thanks to the about 57,000 nurses and health assistants who are from other European Union countries, such as Italy, Spain, Poland, and so on. And NHS would collapse immediately without them, according to the Institute of Public Policy Research, that is an English think tank. I personally think, and I don't want to seem too much cold, because of course also humanitarian or just human spirit should suggest to help refugees, but as I said, those problems that are affecting our societies, such as the sustainability of a social welfare system, would deserve to be discussed and analyzed in a calmer way by one side and a more scientific and deeper way by the other. These issues instead are exasperated, as in many other parts of Europe, also in Budapest. But if in many countries the anti-migrant forces for the moment are in minority, in Hungary they make part of the government. They are the government. And actually the migration crisis here in the second group of countries has been functional to take more and more votes and appreciations by citizens. And so if we pass from a long-term period to the short-term periods, votes are important, are very important. For a country as Hungary, where many other problems should be updated as emergency and treated in order to prevent and solve them, finding an exit way to decide to concentrate is the best solution to distract people from other issues. I would remember that Hungary has shifted back to the 50th position of the international list of corruption, according to ONG Transparency. And the government seemed not to be intending to discuss some measures that could fight this phenomenon. And also about the press of freedom, according to Reporters Sans Frontières, Hungary in 2015 shifted back of 2 positions, going to the 67th position. With a powerful article edited some months ago, The Economist reminds us how attacking people of LGBT community in some African countries or even in Russia with homophobic law was politically useful to hide economic failures, lack of visions, and corruption. The same is occurring in Hungary, but the concentration, the attention is focused on another majority, the migrants. By one side, so internal reasons to attack refugees. By the other hand, again, migrants are used as a weapon to redraw the new balances that will take place within the European Union. Already during the last summer, 2015, the summer of the huge arrival of Syrian refugees, exactly when Hungary was on the Balkan route, the passage of thousands and thousands coming from Middle East, the Hungarian Prime Minister baptized himself as a hero, as a defender of the Christian Europe under attack of Islam, and taken the decision to build iron fencing on the Hungarian-Serbian border. But the real turning point, the real change, I think has occurred much more recently. In particular, I'm referring to the victory of Brexit. The victory at this side of the campaign was possible also because of the hard anti-migrants turns that the Leave campaign took as argumentation. Moreover, after Brexit, thanks again to this way of managing the current challenges, hate crime, violent crime, racist crime rates have considerably increased in England, especially, pay attention, against other European Union citizens, especially against the Polish community in England. And in fact, in the end of August, one Polish guy was killed by some English teenager because he was speaking Polish in a public place. Some xenophobic written appeared around England on many Polish shops and activities, and these facts have pushed the British Prime Minister Theresa May to regret publicly those actions. No regret words and messages have come from Nigel Farage, one or maybe the main protagonist of the Brexit side, that instead during the British referendum campaign in a public interview said he feels uncomfortable when in public spaces in England, such as the Tube, he listens speaking to other languages that are not English. On these facts, those argumentations have been like new sources of inspiration for Orban campaign for the next Saturday referendum. And I would say not just for him. After its victory, attacking migrants is now allowed in public debates. If once were publicly banned or maybe unreasonable, now that front represents a majority in a very civil country as Great Britain. So Leave Front gave again vital energy to Orban that moreover resolute has supported a racist strategy where distortion and lies are the keywords to understand the campaign, such as writing in public posters, as Jean Barthélemy has reminded me yesterday, that the terrorists of Paris attack were refugees came to Middle East. So it's not important if those argumentations do not represent the data reality. More than once, Brussels has called Hungarian Prime Minister to respect European values and laws. But Brexit has shown that European integration is not on one way. It can be changed. And Orban is not alone anymore. He found a partner in crime in Poland, Kaczynski, the strong man in Warsaw, whose party won election last year, and he himself has invoked a fight against the European Commission. But also, let's list some other factors. The no more invisibility of Angela Merkel because of the right-wing, and I would say racist party Alternative für Deutschland. The second ballot in Austria that will take place finally in December, where one of the candidates is far-right exponent that is in favor to close national borders of migrants. Marine Le Pen eyeing in the polls for the next presidential election in France, and if we can generalize more and more, a possible victory for Donald Trump in the US elections and maybe the win of his idea of building a wall across the Mexican borders. All these factors pushed Orban to ask for a deep revision of the European treaties in order to give again more powers to national states. A Europe of people, a Europe of nations, the Prime Minister said. So once again in history, we listen today to words such as national borders, walls, divisions, clash of civilization. Magically, I would say, migration as a word has entered as never before the public political debates in Europe. And it's assumed to affect everything, not just politics, but also economics, society, everyday life. It could be a right occasion to truly speak about the migrations and migrant stories, to tell the history and visualize the present. But unluckily, those who are engaged in talking about it in television, newspapers, social networks, take advantage of the issue in a negative perspective, with many mistakes, lies, and false data. We are living in the post-truth politics, according to The Economist. I tell you, that wrote an interesting article about it some weeks ago, in which reality, the reality based on statistics, is not anymore important. It left space to a reality based on feelings, perceptions, and fears that are, for definition, irrational. The paralysis of the European institution and the lack of a European leadership intended as a vision in the long-term period as a solution for huge problems, have left many European countries victims of populism who simply attack refugees. But after that, no ideas, no projects, no future, just destruction. In this dark period, I think that everyone who has ever studied, worked, or just is interested in migration issues must take part on the present to give his little contribute on a public debate, on a public discussion with positive values, concrete ones, and pragmatic policies, ideas that strongly reject the past, reject the fear, and hug the future and the hope. Thank you.
Only a few minutes to add some data and some argument in the same line of Ricardo, talking about hard data and statistics, which allows us to have a more exact comprehension of what's happening in Europe and all over the world. In the same line of this survey he was mentioning, there's been a few months ago a big survey conducted by Gallup about the image towards migration, which have citizens all over the world, and it's been conducted in 69 countries. In 42 countries out of 69, the majority of population is contrary to migration, absolutely contrary. And what is interesting to remember is that the open-minded, they do live in the less developed country. In countries which have a big demographic basis, for example, Pakistan, Ethiopia, or Vietnam. The country in which average income per year per capita is higher than $35,000. Yeah? Only Iceland, Saudi Arabia, and Suomi, Finland, seems to be really open to migration. The more closest are the one which lives in France or Belgium or Holland. OECD last year publishing a new edition of a study which is cyclical, which is the indicators of integration, has shown that integration chances doesn't have absolutely the same track of migratory process. the more the migration intensity increase, doesn't mean that the more of integration happens. And that is the point. What have we got to do comparing with this phenomenon? If migration has to be, goes on as a mass phenomenon, I think that we have to work about data and demolishing stereotypes. Some of the things that Riccardo quoted were very interesting, but we could add something else. Always in the end of last year, United Nations, which I mean, there was a big group of demographers and scholars has published a volume which is called The World Population Prospects, which offers us a lot of scenarios towards the half of this century, the current century, which is called the century of the migrant, because we are expecting an intensity of flows higher than ever in the past. Well, according to United Nations, the actual asymmetries from the economic and demographic point of view will work even in the future as big, a strong generator of international migrators. Until the half of the century, the States, USA, Canada, and Australia too, United Kingdom, Germany, Russia, and Italy should be the countries which will get the higher number of migrants. Demography maybe is not an exact science, maybe, but could help us to explain something. Actually, a quarter of European population is made of persons which have more than 60 years old. And in the end of this century, they will become the 35%. The median age in our continent is actually 42 years and will grow until 46 in the middle of the century. Actually, in the less developed country, it is 20 years. The median age means the age which divides into groups of the same number, the whole population. United Nations tells us that even if we believe to the most risky scenario, the most risky projections, international migration would be enough to compensate the loss of population, which actually is depends in European to the low taxes of fertility. Not only the cases of Germany and Italy, which are the highest in the world, but all over the countries. Always the same sources tells us that the number of the dead out of the birth in Europe till the middle of the century should be 63 million. Meanwhile, we could wait for 31 million. So it's not replaced. It's not replaced. We gotta consider that half of the total increase, which scholars believe that will be in the next 3 decades, will be exactly concentrated in the sub-Saharan areas, yeah, and the 50 less developed countries in the world would double their population until the 2050. I think that we should try to think about this number, this data, to deconstruct some stereotypes that usually we face every day. Another set of number which I would like to quote in a few minutes is the one which talks about the welfare magnet. American economist has developed a theory which depicts migrant as the perfect aim homo economicus, the one which is able to study where welfare system is more generous. And so he searches for that land. And he tries to get the best he can get from the destination country without paying taxes. This is a kind of rough representation, which has been also theorized. Okay, in Europe, there's an interesting, unknown economic literature, which tells us that only maybe in Sweden and Denmark, there are phenomena of welfare dependency. In other countries, it's exactly the opposite. The problem is not the intensity of the access of migrants, access to social services, to welfare assistance, but exactly the opposite. Because there are eligibility criteria, restrictions, linguistic asymmetries, which does not help migrants to get the help they need. They do really need. So, to conclude, I think that we scholars, we analysts, we researchers have to weigh the burden of dealing with data, with evidence-based research to suggest a solution, a policy making, avoiding on one side what has been called the democratic impatience. I mean, absolute openness, which de-evaluate the role of time in integration process, but also avoiding on the other side the risky situation which is going on about closeness to every access. Thanks.
Me? Yeah. Thank you, Antonella. Thank you. And I'm very glad to be here. I've introduced myself before, but coming from outside the European Union, in the outskirts of Europe, from a small country, which is a long-stretched country as Norway, I will just deal with you. Haven't prepared any papers. I will just share with you my experience during the last year, from September last year until now, in regards to the what somebody calls the migration crisis. That might not be a migration crisis, it could be a refugee crisis. It's a global migration crisis. Anyway, in September 2015, I was teaching migration at the university. 25 students, very, very dedicated. And it happened to be just at the time when the refugee crisis started in the Middle East. So, and I must say, I've predicted this for many, many years. I've been working with this for many years. And we have seen that this must come sometimes, because you cannot live in a world where wealth is so unequally distributed. This is a question of distribution of wealth. It's not only a question of religion or extremism, but it's real a distribution fault. So I will not argue with you, but I will say integration it's much more important than the data. We have to provide the correct data, but in order to solve this crisis in the long term, we have to think, how can we distribute our wealth in the world in a better way? Well, in September, or through the whole year, from September to the end of the year, the number of asylum seekers in Norway more than tripled, and it reached 31,000 at the end of the year. That sounds like a very, very small figure to you. But the fact is, if we look on this in a Norwegian perspective, Norway is a small country with 5.2 million inhabitants. 16.3% of the population are immigrants. That means immigrants born abroad as well as their children. 850,000 out of these 5.2 million are immigrants. And in Oslo, the capital of Norway, 33.0% are immigrants. In my city, the city of Stavanger, which is also sometimes, unluckily, spoken as the oil capital of Norway, where all the big companies are situated, it's more than 22. But in some parts of my city, there are more than, or close to 40% of people immigrants. So we have a huge immigration population in Norway compared to most of the other countries in Europe. That you should be aware of. And if we look upon this crisis, you might ask, well, what is the situation in Norway in regards to racism, in regards to riots, in regards to the burning of cars, etc., etc.? Well, actually, it's relatively calm, relatively peaceful, which means, perhaps, I'm not saying that I am the truth, I have the truth, but the Norwegian government, no matter where it comes from, today it's represents the Conservatives as well as the Progress Party, which is right for the Conservatives, but it also have the Liberal Party and the Christian Democrats. So it's a coalition. They have agreed after a long term of the negotiation that we must provide a integration policy or an immigration policy that is both manageable and sustainable. So when the crisis arose, that unfortunately coincided with the start of the oil crisis in Norway. And as being the oil capital of Norway, there were lots and lots of employees that were sacked. That meant again that many of the large buildings, the offices of the oil company's headquarters, like the BP, were emptied. So what did come out of this? Well, the city of Stavanger, we are going to use these empty buildings as reception centers. So lots of people, 800 people, got a new home in Stavanger in the offices of British Petroleum. That's interesting. And what is not that nice about that is that most of the integration and the establishing of these centers were done by private enterprises. And they earned a lot of money. So you can nearly talk about the richest people in Stavanger. They are those who are running the reception centers. The other thing is that when this occurred, the head of the cultural department in the city of Stavanger, who also was writing the application for Stavanger when it reached its status as European Capital of Culture, he sent out an email to all institutions in the city saying, how can you help people who are coming to the city to make it, well, to make them a better life, in short. So what happened is that the largest regional museum in Stavanger, they offered free access to all museums in the city. The concert hall offered free seats in the concerts for the immigrants. There were also schools that were involved in documentation projects, both photos, but also writing the life stories or short life stories from these immigrants. So, in addition, there was a huge private engagement. People looking at the pictures on the screen, you know, we have television in Norway as well. And we have the phones and we have the internet. So we got access to these pictures. And everybody felt so involved. And they asked themselves, what can I do as a personal human being do in such a horrible situation? So they established lots of aid groups, collecting clothes, etc., 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 and delivered it to the people who were in these reception centers. And maybe the very best thing of this that came out from this reaction is that the Stavanger Museum, which I have argued many, many times, because they don't have a department for migration. And I think that's very curious, since Stavanger is the most international, or one of the most international cities in Norway. And they have a long, long history of immigration as well as emigration. Now, due to this crisis, they finally decided, yes, we have to do something about this topic. So they are planning to put up a department for migration in next year. So that is what actually came out as a concrete result of this crisis. We're talking about crisis. I said 31,000 applicants, refugee applicants in 2015. We are now in September 2016. How many applicants have we achieved or arrived by now? Year 2015, 31,000. This year, 2,200. 2,200. So where is the crisis? The reception centers in Norway, they are being abandoned. They're built down, and since the Minister of Immigration is also the Minister of Integration, she has decided, well, these former reception centers should be developed into integration centers, meaning that the people, the very few people who will come, they predict, will have a short way from the center out into actual work. They will be engaged in the city of Stavanger, having a job, and they will also access language courses in order to cope with the Norwegian language as soon as possible. It is very vital for the ministry to do this very, very quickly. So I'm close to the end now. I'm not going to say very much more. But as a result of this policy, which is the Minister of Integration and Immigration says has become one of the strictest asylum policies in Europe, that means that of all the Moroccans who applied for asylum, none of them will have the asylum. 94% of people from Iraq will be rejected, and 96% of people from Albania will be rejected. None of them will have, only a very few will have the application. Those who will be granted are from Eritrea, Syria, and Ethiopia. 94% of those coming from Eritrea will be granted permission, 88% of Syrians, and 63% of the Ethiopians. So, in total, Norway, due to the new conservative government, has managed to get the immigration and asylum policy under control, but they have, in contrast with what you should think, also managed to, which is a quite surprise for me, managed to keep a positive attitude towards immigrants, because there's a national survey on how ordinary people relate to immigration. And more people are positive to immigration now than before the crisis started. More people are positive to intercultural marriages. More people think that immigrants can contribute to and enrich the cultural life of Norwegians. So I'm not quite sure how, but there is a positive attitude, more now so than it used to be before the crisis. So that's a small report from the city of Stavanger and Norway. Thank you.
Let's go to the...
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting session. I was trying to think what to say because I really didn't work on this migratory crisis. So I was just thinking around, and I came through this book edited by Aline Lindley, which is trying to put together migration and crisis, and she makes a good point of departure that I would like to bring to the fore for discussion. So in this book, she starts by putting together what migration and crisis, when we think about migration and crisis, what we can think about, and she makes the following reflection. Migration is seen as undermining the integrity of the nation state and the bounded identities. Migration is used as a political construction that serves and reorient the dominant policy agenda in desirable ways. So from this point of departure, what I think is interesting in order to think about this migration crisis, I would like to make some reflections and I think more questions than answers. So how can we think about this European crisis? Which could be some of the reflections about this crisis? Well, first of all, it came to me a first reflection I would like to bring to the discussion, how the construction of migration or the construction of mobility has changed with the impact of first the economic crisis in Europe. So I'm going to go, before coming to the migratory crisis, I'm coming to the economic crisis from 2008 onwards. So mobility has been perceived in the European Union as one of the main pillars of the European Union construction. Meaning by mobility, the mobility of students, the mobility of business elites, the mobility of high-skilled workers, the Erasmus stars is one of the stars programs in the European Union construction identity, for instance. So intra-European mobility was promoted since the creation of the United Union, as we know. But this good mobility has its opposites, which is the external immigration flows from third countries that were blocked or stopped through the construction of the fortress Europe. So that was the pillar of the Schengen policy, this construction of the intra-European mobility as a positive way of constructing the European identity, and in relation with the fortress Europe and the immigration as the other pillar of the Schengen policy. But what happened with this construction of mobility and migration as part of the construction of the European Union with the impact of the economic crisis from 2000 onwards? Well, this construction of intra-European mobility as a positive pillar started to be questioned with the development of new migratory flows, of new mobilities from south and east to northern European countries, from those countries that were much touched by the crisis to other countries that were less touched by the economic crisis. And xenophobia, as already many of the speakers in this table and other presenters have already grew up. For instance, in the United Kingdom, they start to speak about the pigs. I don't know if you heard about this word, pigs. This is Portuguese, Irish, Greeks, and Spanish. So, Italian, sorry, I forgot Italian. Sorry. So the link intra-European mobility, a positive pillar for the European Union integration, start to fall down, and with this, the European integration itself start to fall down. Okay, so that was one of my first discussions. So what I wanted to put into the fore for discussion is how can we analyze the migratory crisis at this moment. So there is a turn now to the external factor, which is the high growth of immigration, but immigration, extra immigration, not intra-European immigration. Now the focus is on this external and immigration from non-European countries, asylum seekers, refugees, etc. So how this new migration crisis is having an impact for the European Union construction, already in crisis. So this new focus on external immigration is a way to give less attention to the intra-European mobility crisis, to the European Union mobility crisis, integration crisis. So how can we assess, how we can analyze this crisis in terms also of the European Union integration crisis? It seems that this construction of migration as a social and a political construction of migration bring us to, like, we have already been speaking about this, now how we can think about migration in a positive way as a form, even a form of social capital. Yesterday there was one of the presenters that was speaking about how many parents, they wish their kids to migrate because it creates a form of social capital, a form of capital, the way of being able to move around the world, to have a kind of acquisition. So this positive way of thinking about mobility. But on the other hand, this migration as a deviation, and this negative construction of migration. And I think one of the other pillars that we can put into the discussions, together with what already has been said in the table, we need some more data, we need to focus on integration, of course, but we also need to focus on the construction, on the deconstruction of how migration is used as a political and as a social construction, and how we can maybe try to look for ways of deconstructing these constructions. So this is a little bit my reflections, how nation states, how supranational states use these constructions for the political agenda, and maybe trying to deconstruct these constructions. We can also focus here, in this deconstruction way. This brings me to the last point that I wanted to bring to the fore and to the discussion, which is the political instrumentation of migrants. So because here, the big debate is how migrants are instrumentalized for political reasons, yes, aims. So without considering migrants themselves, because we are thinking about migratory crisis, but what are migrants? What do they think about this migratory crisis? How do they live this migratory crisis? How they have been affected by this migratory crisis? So I think we need also for more data, but not only statistical data. We need also for more qualitative data that could show up which are the strategies that migrants are facing now in the framework of this migration, the social and political construction of the migration crisis. And we have to also see how they are affected by the crisis. I was thinking about that because when I did my study on Spanish migration to France, one of the things that I found out is how those migrants that migrated during the Franco regime were very much instrumentalized by the Franco regime, and how they had this idea or project very much depending on what this instrumentalization of the migration was at that period of time. And this really had an impact, very big impact on their trajectories and on their lives, and a very negative impact on their trajectories. How the instrumentalization of migrants from the political regimes really have an impact on the trajectories of migrants and everything. And this, we really sometimes don't highlight so much this. And history is repeating all the time. You already, some of the speakers already show us the pictures, now how the history is repeating. And I just wanted to make all these reflections and questions for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you also for connecting the refugee crisis with something which is much less important, their dramatic situation, but it's also important for us, which is the Schengen mobility, which is in threat. Now our last speaker will be Sarah with a very short video on the Calais crisis.
Okay, thank you, Madalena. I will not make a speech, but show you two short videos about Calais. First one is the beginning of a movie from Yolande Moreau, who is a French director who spent time in Calais. And so it's just the beginning. It's in French, but it's more than to have like a vision of situation. And the other one is a very short film made by drone up to the jungle in Calais, and it belongs to a work, a large project led by a collective of researchers, photographers, and artists who wants to document what's happening in Calais. And the question also to link history and actuality is how we can document and build history of the situation now, because everything is going on emergency, everything is in humanitarian, and it's not, of course, the preoccupation of the people arriving in Europe and people taking care and helping those. So how we build the story for tomorrow, because a lot of countries also just want to make this camp disappear or to not have like links, but not have like a bad and negative pictures of what's happening now. So that's a question around these two projects.
في البداية من حاولت من تركيا طلعنا على أحد الجزر اليونانية اسمها جزيرة ميتيليني. من هذه الجزيرة بالباطرة رحنا على أثينا، ومن أثينا من عاصمة يونان رحنا على مقدونيا هنا، ومن مقدونيا رحنا على صربيا، ومن صربيا دخلنا على كرواتيا، وبعد كرواتيا دخلنا على هنغاريا. دخلنا على هنغاريا هنا. بعد هنغاريا دخلنا على نمسا. دخلنا على نمسا هون. وبعد نمسا طلعنا على ألمانيا. ومن ألمانيا وصلنا لفرنسا. وهسه حاليا اني هنا هاد دانتي وباقي لي مسافه اقطع على اروح لندن.
Le vent souffle. Ça sent le sel marin et le cri des mouettes. Calais, Grande Sainte, depuis toujours contemplant la Flandre et l'Angleterre. Faut-il être carrefour ou citadelle? Vous a-t-on dit que vous seriez des ombres, qu'il n'y aurait pour vous aucune terre? Vous a-t-on dit qu'après la guerre, il y aurait la misère des terres battues par le vent? Vous a-t-on dit que vous n'auriez plus de nom? Nulle part ici, nulle part ailleurs. Vous a-t-on dit que vous auriez nulle part pour seule patrie?
انا اسمي هاوري من كردستان، من مدينه كركوك. كردستان تابع الجزء التابع للعراق. عمري 28 سنه، خريج كليه العلوم قسم جيولوجي. صار لي شهر انا بدانتي هناك بالمنطقه. بديت المحاولات 6 محاولات فاشله، 5 محاولات فاشله، السادسه قدرت اطلع يعني وصل اليونان. المحاوله الاولى غرقنا، اجى الخفر السواحل التركي طلعنا من البحر ورجعنا. المحاوله الثانيه حاولنا ورحنا. بالمحاوله الثانيه الماطور مال البلم عطل بينا، فتقريبا اخذت وياه اسبوعين، حوالي اسبوعين و20 يوم، ايش حوالي تقريبا. بقيت بتركيا وبعدين طلعت اليونان، ومن اليونان لحد ما وصلت لهنا تقريبا يعني اخذ وياه 10 ايام 7 ايام، ما اتذكر بالضبط لان صار لي هوايه.
Combien avez-vous pris de routes, de sentiers, de chemins pour arriver jusqu'ici? Combien d'heures d'attente, d'espoir tronqué? Il a fallu monter dans des barques, des voitures, des trains, de jour, de nuit. Il a fallu parcourir des milliers de kilomètres, marcher pas à pas, encombré, apeuré, courir parfois. Il a fallu des mois entiers de voyage, car les terres sont longues pour les ombres qui n'ont rien.
والله طبعا احنا هربنا من الموت وجينا هنا. حاليا احنا بفرنسا باقيين هنا. مطار قاعد تشوف البلاطين، الخيام مالتنا اللي فيها مرات بالليل المي ينقط علينا. يعني تعالي شوفي حياتنا.
La terre refuse de boire, l'eau tombée, gelée, l'eau de pluie, de crachin ou de rabasse. Et elle s'étale en flaques, prend possession des lieux. La terre refuse de boire. Peut-être qu'elle ne veut pas des hommes et n'a qu'une hâte, qu'ils capitulent et s'en aillent. Le vent est son allié, coup puissant qui arrache les bâches patiemment attachées, coups permanents qui font claquer tout ce qui bouge. Le vent mordant, sifflant, qui vient lécher les tentes.
والله بصراحة يعني مع والدتي أنا ما قايل إنه أنا بهالمكان، ما قايل إنه أنا بهالمكان اللي تشوفين أنت، فأنا قايل أنا بأحلى مكان في فرنسا ومكان كلش حلو، وأنا بأوروبا وحياتنا كلش حلوة هنا.
Au milieu de tout ça, un drapeau flotte, triste, comme le dernier souvenir du pays quitté.
So I enter it because it's half hour, and if you want information, I can send you the link. You can see it on internet. And the name of this documentary is Nowhere in France. So it's they say, she explains that people leave the country for different reasons, and they just arrive nowhere. No, they don't have place anywhere, so they are just nowhere, and they just move like shadows in this area and this country to wait for crossing the sea. So I think it's really belonging also to the history of Europe, because they cross, of course, all Europe, and they arrive in this city, in Calais, with like a world city, because it's welcome. All the people, a lot of people arrive in this city, but after what's happening. So I just to show you, it's 2 minutes, the other one, and yeah. And, so it's the same place, around the same place, but focus from Rome. This is the port of Calais and the road to go to the Channel. On the left, it's the new building, because there was a part of the jungle just before the summer. It's a big container for people. And so, to conclude, I just want to, I think you heard about it, but the French president wanted to explain at the beginning of this week that he wants to erase and destroy this all the jungle before the end of the year. And of course, there is election of president next year, so there is like focus of what's happening there. And on the the West, British just began this week also to build a big wall. It's like the construction of Europe, I think, to protect the roads who is going yes to the channel and to the port, everything. So the politicians in France don't say anything about this wall. But we heard in the little things that maybe it's not necessary because at the end of the year, when the wall will be finished, there will not have anybody there. So it's very awful situation, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I have a big problem. I don't know if we can start a discussion which will last 2 days or we'll adjourn and Mr. President said we'll adjourn. And we continue the discussion informally among us, probably. I'm sorry that we do not have time. So let's continue the discussion later on, wherever. And I have two announcements. The first one is that for those of you who presented papers at the AMI conference, you are very much welcome and invited to present them to be published on the AMI journal and either mail it to to Hans or to Emilia or to me or to Sarah, and we will proceed in Hans will proceed in working on the journal. The second announcement is that we are all going to have a picture taken downstairs in the courtyard. In the square. Okay. Right now. And then during the break, I mean, I think there is a coffee break, isn't it? No coffee. So just a picture. Okay. Just a break.